Now we live in this fantasy world where I think a lot of people misuse data and stats, and it's kind of irritating on my end if I'm being transparent about it. Like, I don't want us to be pegged as morons because there are people that are misusing certain numbers that don't matter at all. Is there a stat that you think maybe you see as overused and overstated most within the space, or is there something out there that you think that people just sort of have saturated and just talked about way too much when it doesn't matter that much?
Yeah, well, it depends on who we're talking about. Like, are we talking about fellow analysts? Are we talking about like the average player in the space? For the latter, I would definitely say it's touches. I've been on this holy crusade against touches for a number of years, like raw touches for a
Yes.
running back,
Yeah.
and I think that's just such a worthless stat when you consider in a PPR league targets are worth 2.5 times as much as a carry on average, and then within that, like red zone carries are worth 2.7 times as much as a carry outside of the red zone. So why would you ever look at touches if you're
Right.
talking about fantasy? I created a stat a number of years ago, weighted opportunity, which like appropriately encapsulates all that, but like even that is inferior and redundant to XFP. So
Right.
just use XFP for analysts. I would say the most overrated or overused or misused stat is EPA, which is really just a team stat for running backs. That's really just a play caller stat, because like the way EPA works is like you should never be running the ball outside of the red zone. So like it really just kind of, the most efficient running backs are just the running backs with the most forward thinking play callers who, only run in the correct spots, like short down and distance, things like that. Another stat that's like really popular among analysts is targets per route run. That's a
Mm.
really sticky stat. But like sticky isn't as important as predictive. Like a really sticky stat is QB height. Like a
Yeah.
quarterback comes in the league, they're probably not going to be growing any inches in height because they're over the age of 20. And just like 19 times out of 20, targets per route run is inferior to target share. So you have, people like, oh, Kadarius Toney, Wan'Dale Robinson. But like, I mean, 80% of their targets are like screens or design. Well, not that high, but
Yeah.
screens or design targets where like they're literally only coming on the field on plays that are designed specifically for them. And then you have like, a guy with a 60% route share, but a 0.3 target per route run isn't anywhere close to a 90% route share full-time player with a 0.27 target per route run. So that's one that just kind of, I don't know, kind of annoys me a little bit.
Well, that's the thing too, is I think a lot of metrics in general need to be used in conjunction with other metrics, is really what you're
Right.
saying. Like a targets per route run can be fine as long as you're giving that context. If you're giving it context with Kadarius Toney versus a Justin Jefferson who's run, or Tyreek Hill, let's say, who's running an absurd number of routes, that's important, right? Or if you're using it in conjunction with yards per route run and such, and snap share. And you mentioned EPA. EPA is really interesting because you and I, back in the number fire days, speaking of
Mm-hmm.
which, net expected points was number fire. Like number fire was one of the first, like the OGs. Not the OG. I mean, expected points models were created before number fire, but expected points numbers were not nearly as big as they are now, where you can literally find ESPN personalities citing EPA, and people kind of inherently sort of understanding. I don't think people really understand fully what expected points added really is and how it's calculated and stuff like that. But you have a general idea of like, oh, this metric can tell us something descriptive, right? But I do think that what's funny is back in the number fire days, we had net expected points, and we were basically using that as a driver for a lot of the content that we were doing. And then sort of as the years went on, it was like, this isn't like a bad metric, but there are just other volume related metrics that you can focus on that are going to give you, better information than what this is saying. And then, on top of that, EPA, like EPA per rush or EPA per target, whatever, or even drop back, you're telling more of a story with those numbers, in my opinion, than actually like talking about what's going to happen, that you talk about descriptive versus predictive numbers. And it's another number where I think it needs context, where if you're going to use EPA per rush for a running back, let's say, you better use something like success rate alongside it. Like you need something to give you more of that like binary, was it a success or not? Or else it's no different than yards per rush and yards per carry at the end of the day. Like
which is one of the worst stats.
Which is one of the worst stats on the planet. Yeah. I mean, if you want to talk like overused by like, we're obviously like talking about, smarter, players and analysts and stuff. But if you want to talk about like generally overused, yards per carry is probably the worst. Like, I mean, you get people coming at us or coming at an analyst like after the Lions play the Packers and they're yelling because Jahmyr Gibbs had a better yards per carry than David Montgomery without realizing like David Montgomery's facing stacked boxes so much more. And that there's just so much more context that's needed. Not only that, but there's like 8 carries that you're talking about with Jahmyr Gibbs in that sort of scenario.
Do you remember the Toby Gerhart days?
Yeah. Oh yeah. Of course I remember the Toby Gerhart days. Yeah. Yeah. But yards per carry it's just not a good metric to base your argument on. If you're, there are times where I'm just going to cite a random metric to sort of tell a story and take you on a journey, about a player, about a situation. It's not going to be the crux of the argument. It should never be the crux of the argument, that one singular number. But all of these things need to work together, as you were saying. And I think that the targets per route run one is one to really, really, that's a good one to call out, because it is way more scheme and situation based than people give it credit for. And there's even been more work. I'm sure you've done some. I know that Hayden Winks has done a lot, analyzing how things like yards per route run and targets per route run differ in 11 and 12 personnel, right? Drake London last season, for instance, he was obviously is a good player in and of itself, but his per route run numbers are probably inflated at least a little bit when you consider competition and you consider how often they had 11 and ran 11 personnel. More wide receivers on the field means that there's a higher chance that a target's going to be divvied up or it can go to other directions. And so you have to at least keep that kind of stuff in mind. It doesn't mean that yards per route run or targets it doesn't mean that they're worthless. It just means that you need a little bit more context whenever you're using these numbers, and that them alone is not sufficient enough.